Hello, I'd like to welcome Mina Hong, who's a longtime policy advocate and an expert on early childhood issues, to speak to us a little bit today about social welfare policy in the early childhood space. So welcome, Mina. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I wondered if you could start out by just sharing a little bit about what you see are some of the major policy issues facing early childhood in the U.S. today.
Yeah, sure. I think one of my primary concerns right now in early childhood is actually not just an impact on early childhood, but in the U.S. right now, we've just made some sweeping tax changes right at the end of 2017. And people oftentimes, when they think of public policy, sometimes forget about the interconnectedness between policy and funding, right? Our public budget, our federal budgets and our state budgets all impact the types of social welfare policies that we have in our states and in our communities. And so, the recent tax shift means that we will have fewer revenues coming into the federal budget. And so that means the federal budget will have less resources to put out to states to support their social welfare programs, including early childhood services. And so that's something that is of concern to me currently.
Can you give us a little bit of a description about when we say kind of early childhood, what that means, kind of who counts in early childhood, and kind of what are some of the kind of overarching issues, obviously that funding all impacts, but some of the types of issues that fall into the early childhood space.
Yeah, sure. So children, of course, don't live in isolation. They live within the context of families. Typically, when we talk about early childhood, some people talk about, from like prenatally through 5 years old or through third grade. Those early years are really what we're focused on when we talk about early childhood. But the services are always, programs that are for families with young children. So you think about things like access to childcare services, or you think about access to health insurance and health care for young children and their families. You think about things like home visiting services for new parents. These are all early childhood services that I think of, but you could also take it more broadly in terms of things like cash assistance benefits for families, right? If a parent is struggling to meet basic needs, that's going to impact their children. So it's sort of that broad umbrella of social policies, but there are many areas specifically focused on young children.
Great. So I'd like to focus in on one of the areas that you mentioned, the importance of childcare, and childcare is an issue. And we know that there's increasing demand for childcare, and both in terms of the effect it has on children and on their families, but also on the childcare settings and childcare workers. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit from your experience about childcare as an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you mentioned, childcare is an issue that affects many people. And in the U.S., we've seen a rise in childcare costs. And that rise in childcare costs actually is interconnected to what we know in terms of what works in early childhood. The brain science that we've learned about the impact of high quality care can really reduce and mitigate disparities that we see early on. People sometimes talk about that kindergarten readiness gap. So there's large groups of children who start kindergarten and are ready to, do the kindergarten thing. And there are some children that come in and they're really underprepared. They're not recognizing letters and those types of things. And so high quality childcare we know can reduce and eliminate that gap. But it comes with a cost, right? We're talking about having teachers who are trained with credentials. We're talking about low child care to child ratios so that they can really get the optimal care that they need in those young years. But I think there's also this perception that childcare is an individual family responsibility when we really look at childcare being an integral part of our sort of education system at large. So typically when people think about education, they think about kindergarten through high school. Some people have now looked also at expanding the role of education to be sort of from birth or prenatally all the way to college credential or another credential after high school that can get you into a path towards career. And so if you look at this broader expansion of education, these early childhood years are really essential to laying the foundation so that children can succeed in their educational careers. And so we need to think about childcare in that way as well.
Yeah, becomes a really foundation building block when you think of it that way.
Yeah.
So you kind of mentioned or alluded to a little bit about some of the specific challenges, but I'm wondering if you could go a little bit more into helping us to better understand what those challenges are that you see currently in early childhood policy.
Yeah, sure. So like many social welfare policies, childcare, the childcare piece of it started at the federal level in terms of federal funding for childcare subsidies. And these are subsidies geared towards low-income families who have a childcare need. And so our subsidies, however, are oftentimes, as a whole, the federal pot of childcare money is too small to meet the demand of what low-income families need around childcare. So that's the first major problem, is that we have this resource that's not adequately addressing the needs of the population it's supposed to intended to serve. So that's a primary concern. So then if you look at those families who really are the ones that are whose children are most likely to experience that readiness gap, we need to do better for them. But then by being able to improve access for them, we can really sort of improve the childcare pool as a whole and really elevate the level for everybody. By putting in more public resource into the childcare system, we know that everybody's foundation will improve, and hopefully people's costs will also come down.
So in terms of your own, so you've been working in the early childhood space for many years. Can you give us an example of a particular policy or a particular specific issue within early childhood that you've been working on or that you've seen some movement on?
Yeah, one of the areas of early childhood and childcare that I worked on specifically in the state of Michigan was around that childcare subsidy and what does that look like. We were really focusing on increasing the amount of subsidy parents could receive. We were at one point providing for some providers, a couple dollars an hour for childcare. And if you know anything about, that's really nothing, right? And so trying to figure out how can we increase that subsidy amount so that the lowest income families can access better quality care for their children, right? And so that was really a big priority of Michigan's children. And we worked quite closely with the State Department of Education and advocates and families across the state to work on that issue.
Great. So thinking you were kind of already talking about some of the kinds of solutions. So in this case, promoting subsidies for families and higher income subsidies. Or are there some additional solutions or thoughts that you have in terms of people who are interested in knowing more about early childhood, being able to start to think about potential solutions for moving forward?
I think one of the areas where the early childhood field lags in terms of the rest of the sort of child-serving field is the general perception that child care providers aren't professionals, or that they're just taking care of children, but that's like one of the most important things that we need to be doing, and they're really laying that foundation. And so there's been a lot of effort, I think, and there needs to be more effort around how we best support early childhood providers in terms of their professional development and their pay, to make sure that they are, coming into the system and they're able to continue to be child care providers because we're giving them a livable wage, and supporting their growth in their area of profession. So that's one thing that we're sort of, there's some movement towards that, but many states, when you can't even afford, to provide families with basic subsidies, it can be really hard to then also think about putting additional resource into a system around professional development. So a lot of times that's something that lags behind, especially if you think about all this professional development we provide our K-12 teachers. So that's one area.
So I wanted to ask a question about, we've been talking a lot about early childhood in the U.S. And just wondering, in terms of from a global perspective, and obviously there's many different types of examples, but do you think that there are some lessons that we could learn in the U.S. from looking to other countries in terms of thinking about early childhood policy, early childhood issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing that is sort of very obvious is that the U.S. really lags in terms of our paid parental leave. We don't have a uniform paid parental leave system for our country. There's, Family Medical Leave Act, but that really only guarantees unpaid leave and not for everybody. A lot of other countries, I think, put a lot more value on that maternal child bond and the parental child bond, particularly with new babies, and understanding the importance of that attachment by providing more robust parental leave for moms and dads, and giving them much longer leave with some resource, some funding, paid leave. And that's really an example that we can look to. I think it also sort of ties back, though, to the funding piece, right? These other countries have decided that that's an important value of their country in terms of supporting young children in that way and supporting families with young children in that way. And so they fund that. They have the revenue that they bring in to support that type of opportunity. So that's something that we haven't done in the U.S. A few states have picked up here and there, but it's not anything uniform.
Great. Thanks. Well, you've given us a lot to think about. So just in closing, are there, given all that we've talked about today, are there some important things that you think that people watching this MOOC and social work students who are interested in social welfare, or people just interested in social welfare policy in general, should be considering when they're thinking about early childhood issues?
Yeah, I think, it comes back to sort of the interconnectedness of young children within our communities and our families. And so regardless of if, people are advocating for issues around juvenile justice or issues around, food access, whatever their social welfare interests might be, typically there will be impacts on young children just because they are in so many different families. And so thinking about what that means from a young child's perspective, thinking about what that looks like in terms of resources when we're doing any sort of budget advocacy, and making sure that we're not forgetting about our young children when we're having those conversations, I think is really important.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you all for watching.